Novus, the new voice. Vox Novus, the new dimension. Vox Novus, thought and movement leaders who will share from their experience and offer tools to help us navigate our rapidly changing world. My name is Victor Fuhrman. Welcome to Vox Novus, the new voice. We all know a healthy diet is one of the best ways to live a great life. But sometimes our minds lead us down paths we do not want to end up in. Orthorexia is one such example. It's an eating disorder full of unintended consequences and unhealthy preoccupation with eating healthy food. Of course, it's great to eat wholesome and nutritious food as often as possible, but when you're suffering from orthorexia, you'll find yourself obsessing over what you want to put into your mouth, so much so that it becomes detrimental to your overall well-being. My guest this week on Vox Novus, Dr. James Greenblatt, has decades of experience treating patients for eating disorders and helping patients find a simple path forward to a complete and lasting recovery. As someone who has redefined psychiatry, Dr. Greenblatt takes a holistic approach to treatment with a focus on nutrition. His websites are jamesgreenblattmd.com and psychiatryredefined.org, and he joins me this week to discuss orthorexia, anorexia, and his groundbreaking book, Answers to Anorexia. Please join me in welcoming to Vox Novus Dr. James Greenblatt. Welcome, Dr. Greenblatt.
Thank you, Victor. It's good here to be with you.
Thank you. Now, please share with our listeners your path to psychiatry and your work in integrative medicine.
Sure. I've been practicing medicine for almost 35 years, and my journey's been kind of winding. I walked into medical school thinking I was going to cure the world with brown rice and kale. I was a vegan at the time, actually teaching yoga to medical students. And 9 years later, I came out with this, psychopharmacology degree, a child and adolescent psychiatrist. It was not the plan. But very quickly, when I got out in the world, I realized that medicines were not effective. They were Band-Aids, so they can be effective, but not the path that I wanted to take. And over the 30 clinical years, I've tried to help educate clinicians about the role of mindfulness and nutrition in mental health and mental wellness.
And how did you come to work with eating disorders in particular?
Another complete accident. I took a job as chairman of a psychiatry department that had a small unit, 7 beds, and I was responsible for, the unit. From there, that hospital closed and a new group took over, and we developed that unit from 7 beds to now a system of care in 3 states and outpatient, inpatient, residential. So I stuck with it for so long because it was just an area that I could merge my interests of nutrition and brain function. It was hard for my colleagues to argue that our patients with anorexia weren't malnourished. So I could talk about vitamins and minerals to colleagues for the last 20, 30 years.
Now, we'll be discussing your work on both Anorexia nervosa, which most of our listeners have some familiarity with, and also Orthorexia nervosa, which I had not heard of until reading your article about it. But before we get into these discussions, please tell us about your program, Redefining Psychiatry.
I think anyone that's touched the psychiatric community, either as a patient or family member, struggles with where we're at. We've not had the advances the rest of medicine has really provided. We're still a symptomatic-based model, medications for every symptom, and that hasn't been effective. The outcomes are poor. So Psychiatry Redefined was a program we've been working on for many years and now developed it as an educational platform for clinicians and patients to understand what we describe as an integrative and functional model. So it's an educational platform with hundreds of hours of content trying to trained clinicians, there's a deeper and more holistic way of treating patients with depression, anxiety, and all diagnosis in mental illness.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's an important thing. What our listeners are interested in is body, mind, and spirit. So it's a combination of all those things. And I think science, hard science, has possibly neglected some of that for many years. So thank you so much for doing that work.
Sure.
Let's start with anorexia nervosa. How long has this been clinically defined? And prior to that, what was the history?
Well, we can go back at least to 1600s with some of the saints, and they're probably we can go back further in history. So there's always been descriptions of men and women, mostly women, who've resorted to kind of not eating, restricting calories, and whether it's due to a spiritual journey, it ends up in a place of both malnutrition and very distorted brain function. We, in this country in the 60s and 70s, we started seeing more kids with anorexia, and very easily kind of blamed parents and blamed the culture, the articles, the movies, and what people were seeing. And quickly that model didn't work. And what I've been most interested in understanding anorexia as kind of a brain-based genetic disorder that is actually the most life-threatening illness in all of psychiatry.
Wow. I remember growing up in the 60s, the English model Twiggy, and she became a fashion icon, and all of the girls I knew wanted to emulate her look. But you're saying that rather than societal pressures based upon things of this nature, this was really a disease.
Absolutely. And certainly our Facebook concerns now and social media and the magazines, the models absolutely play a factor, but they don't cause it because, let's say we knew 100 young women looking at Twiggy, only 1 or 2 of them developed anorexia nervosa. And we do understand that as a genetic-based disorder now.
That's interesting. Have they found the actual genetic makeup, the DNA that causes this?
Well, they did a major international study with thousands of patients with anorexia and controls. And what they found, a cluster of genes. And what was interesting and helpful for my work is they were able to, for the first time, say this cluster of genes has to do with metabolism, the regulation of metabolism, which is vitamins and minerals, what I've been kicking and screaming at clinicians for years. So we don't know the exact gene, but a very strong genetic association has been demonstrated.
What are the thought patterns and emotions that result in someone becoming anorexic? The
initial kind of a step into anorexia nervosa is often a change in diet, and that could be unintentional, either wanting to lose weight, someone told the pediatrician, said you might need to lose weight. So there's some dietary change. The most concerning, which we can talk about later, is changing to a vegetarian or vegan diet for many of these kids. And then what happens as weight loss and nutritional deficiencies take hold, that kind of perfect storm of genetic vulnerability, malnutrition, often stress, creates these distortions of thinking, perceptual distortions, where individuals become very, very thin, but they actually believe, and their brain is telling them that they're very obese and overweight.
Is there an actual visual response when someone with anorexia looks in a mirror?
Yes, we can look at brain scans, and when they look at themselves, it's a very different process than when they look at others. They can kind of tell who would be thin and who might be overweight in other people's, but it's a profound distortion of their brain. When they look in the mirror, they do see a very overweight, obese individual, even though they might be emaciated and dying.
In your book, Answers to Anorexia, second edition, which just came out in September, your first section is entitled Anorexia Redefined. How has this been redefined?
Well, my goal is to help people understand what is really in front of us, which is a malnourished individual who's been restricting nutrients for so long that malnutrition affects brain function. And there have been no treatment programs that have really addressed nutritional supplementation. Everything is about gaining weight and calories. And what I've seen over so many years of practice is these patients just relapse because they're not provided the adequate minerals and vitamins that they have become deficient in. So the redefinition for me is helping clinicians and families understand that nutritional support can be the path to preventing relapse.
What percentage of the population has anorexia?
It's a very small percent. It's only, between 1% and 3%. So we're talking about very small numbers. But the lethality, not only is the most lethal illness, but it's the highest risk of suicide of any psychiatric illness, more so than depression, addiction, or anything else. It's really very frightening.
And in that population, what percentage men, what percentage women?
Oh, for anorexia, it's still close to 9, 10 to 1 females to men.
Wow. Is there any, is that linked to that genetic finding?
We believe so, but certainly when I started, we might see a male in the hospital once a month. Now we have male patients with anorexia every day. So certainly males are being both diagnosed and treated, and in many ways the illnesses look identical.
You have a chapter in your book entitled Balanced Brain Health, Think Zinc. I've always thought of zinc as an immune system booster. Please share how zinc helps the brain and is beneficial to those dealing with anorexia.
Well, that's probably a 6-hour lecture. There's just so many.
That's okay. Go for it.
I'll distill it into, if we took a list of symptoms of zinc deficiency, and we have animal studies and some human cases, it's pretty close to what anorexia nervosa looks like. One, there's a disturbance in digestion, because all your digestive enzymes require zinc, so you don't feel well when you eat. Depression, attention problems, skin problems, sleep problems. You need zinc to make melatonin, which supports sleep. You need zinc to make the neurotransmitters, serotonin. I haven't proven it, but I've read that almost every enzyme in the brain requires zinc as a cofactor. So between the depression, anxiety, and digestion, it provides this perfect storm, if you will, because puberty is one time, the other time is pregnancy, where these kids have a higher need for zinc. And if they're restricting zinc due to a vegan diet or just not having an adequate diet, that to me has been described as the perfect storm.
We think of iron deficiency. This has been something that's been promoted since I was a kid, at least, with iron supplements, but no one really talked about zinc supplements.
Not at all. I mean, I think more information is there. It's quite well researched. Oftentimes, our medical colleagues think it's a little too simple for this life-threatening illness, but it has profound implications for health.
In general, just for the general population, how much zinc should they have in their diet?
Well, the kind of standard requirement is about 9 or 10 milligrams, and that's not difficult to get if you're eating an animal-based diet. But there's so many factors, and this is part of the 6-hour lecture, that impairs our ability to get zinc. And I'm sure many of your listeners will be familiar. All the plastics, all the pesticides, many of the environmental toxins bind zinc, so they make it less available. And certain dietary habits, like a very concentrated grain diet. There's chemicals called phytates in grains that also bind zinc to make it unavailable. So one story that I often tell is, the most concentrated source of zinc in for dietary intake would be oysters. But if you had oysters with a piece of bread, you would absorb half the zinc from the oysters. So it's easy to think about the 10 milligrams, but not always attainable.
So in essence, that 10 milligrams is something that has to be taken into consideration with the rest of your dietary practices.
Correct. Absolutely.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, the most important thing that I teach, or I've learned over the years, is everybody has slightly different nutrient requirements, and some people need higher.
And going back to your talk about veganism and vegetarianism, you have a lot of concerns about that. Please explain.
I do, and I always get nervous getting in front of an audience of health-conscious people and someone throwing something at me. So let me preface it by saying I'm not against a vegetarian diet in adults, but what we have seen, and there's plenty of research, is that a vegetarian, but more commonly a vegan diet in adolescents often results in poorer health, and we have hundreds of studies demonstrating the association between a restrictive vegetarian diet and the onset of eating disorders. There's just not as much bioavailable zinc, B12, and protein to get through puberty.
So for children and for young adolescents, they should have at least some form of meat in their diet.
Well, I think I would not say that in public. I might think it. But what I would say in public is if they're not eating animal products, which I do think is fine and can be healthy, zinc and B12 has to be monitored or supplemented. That's my message. Not that everyone should eat meat, but it's hard to get adequate B12 and zinc if you're an adolescent eating a lot of chips and pasta.
So you share that there are other supplements in your book that are also helpful for brain health. You mentioned zinc, you mentioned B12. What are some of these other supplements?
Well, the core, program has to do with some of the macronutrients, we call them, and these would be fatty acids, essential fatty acids. Fat has been really the one class of food that many anorexics completely avoid, and the brain is 60% fat. And we know low levels of fat, and this research has gone back 30 or 40 years, affects brain function. The low levels of cholesterol affects depression and suicide, and low levels of the omega-3 that we see in fish and nuts and seeds. Research has shown it affects anxiety, depression, and suicide.
What are the greatest sources of fatty acids, healthy fatty acids?
The easiest, most bioavailable would be fish. The smaller fish, the fatty fish, the herrings, anchovies, or salmon, but certainly nuts and seeds also has omega-3s. So there are plenty of sources, but our patients with anorexia, again, are restricting fat and often are not getting adequate omega-3 fatty acids.
And what about supplemental fatty acids?
To me, it's a core part of a recovery for patients with anorexia nervosa because because of the illness, there's no way they're going to be able to get adequate fat in their diet, certainly at the early stages of recovery. So supplements, I think, are critical.
Are there strictly medical conditions that mimic anorexia?
There are a couple that, just scream out and not always properly assessed. And one is celiac disease. Celiac disease is an autoimmune disorder where there's a reaction to the gluten in wheat. And because it kind of destroys the intestine, our patients just malabsorb all nutrients like zinc and B12 and amino acids and the iron. So eventually they become malnourished. And again, those genetically prone might develop anorexia nervosa. So one is celiac. The other one that's getting a little more discussion among medical colleagues now is the pandas. These are reactions to infectious agents, strep, Lyme, that cause a autoimmune response in the brain that for some reason we don't completely understand often result in eating disorders.
Any ideas to the mechanism?
It's probably a immunological, inflammatory response. There's cross-reactivity to antibodies in the brain. So our body's trying to fight the infection, but it mistakes some of the certain areas of the brain. So it looks like it's an autoimmune response.
My guest is Dr. James Greenblatt. He's the Chief Medical Officer at Walden Behavioral Care in Waltham, Massachusetts. Dr. Greenblatt, please tell our listeners where they can get your books and find out more about you and your work.
Sure. The educational platform is psychiatryredefined.org, and my website with the books are listed at jamesgreenblattmd.com.
And at psychiatryredefined.org, what can the non-professionals find there?
I think the programs on anorexia would be very helpful and appropriate. They're geared towards professionals, but I think if you have a loved one or a colleague or friend, you'll get information about the research on zinc and fatty acids in the gut and how we've kind of missed the treatment model for the most part with our traditional treatment of anorexia nervosa.
And what do others in the profession find there?
Clinicians will find probably 150 hours now of content, of courses, of symposium, of webinars, looking at an integrative and functional approach to mental health treatment.
And we'll be back with more of Dr. James Greenblatt after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
The best of the holistic, spiritual, and conscious world. OMTimes Radio. IOM-FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes Magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going On? My passion is sifting through information, research, and innovations from new thought teachers, speakers, and researchers pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics, and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
Look out, world, we're getting strong. The future's here and we belong. She can STEM, she can do more. Like build a rocket and watch it soar. Or clean the oceans and make the world a better place. Oh, she can STEM, so can you. Find a cure, invent something new. There's no challenge in the world that she can't face. She can STEM.
Learn more at She Can STEM, a message brought to you by the Ad Council.
My early Alzheimer's diagnosis was hard to take.
But it gave my mom and me more time to plan, together.
Talk to your family about seeing a doctor. Go to alz.org/time to talk. A message from the Alzheimer's Association and the Ad Council.
Back on Vox Novus, my guest this week is Dr. James Greenblatt. We're talking about eating disorders. What are the other treatment options that are offered for anorexia?
Well, our current treatment model is a multidisciplinary team. Most patients would have a dietitian, a therapist, and maybe a psychiatrist prescriber. I think there's inpatient programs for those that can't restore weight as outpatients, and then there's residential treatment programs. And I believe those 24-hour programs can be very helpful. What has been missed in most of them is a more integrative holistic approach looking at nutritional support.
And what else do you bring into play in these treatments? Do you bring in mindfulness techniques, meditation?
Some of them, I think some of the better programs do. In our program, we've hired a full-time naturopath, and mindfulness and heart rate variability programs are critically important. There's yoga, there's art therapy. There are many kind of opportunities, but we need to help our patients who have these distortions around eating in multiple modalities to get them on a path to recovery.
What hope do you offer those who are suffering from anorexia?
The most important thing I can say is the earlier treatment, better. Don't wait. Don't wait for the next day or the next week or the next year, because the longer someone has anorexia, the higher risk of mortality and the harder it is to treat. And so if we can get these kids, and primarily why I wrote the book for parents, into treatment early, we can completely turn the course of this life-threatening illness around.
What are some of the warning signs that parents can look for?
The biggest is, a change in dietary habits. So restricted eating is the most common. The red flag, your child comes home and the family is not a vegetarian household. The child comes home and is eating a vegan vegetarian diet. Sometimes it's just so they can avoid, high-fat foods. So a change in diet, change in behavior, kids that were very motivated for school, now spending a lot of time on social media, because there's a lot of support, and some of the Facebook and Instagram controversies that are being discussed now demonstrated that there's both websites that support kids with anorexia and the kind of Facebook social media network does not really provide any kind of roadblocks or warnings for kids or parents.
And not as often heard about, but is bulimia still a problem?
Absolutely. I think bulimia is where there's kind of a compensatory behavior, and oftentimes it's actually purging. So individuals throwing up after they eat. Sometimes it could be excessive exercise or laxatives. But bulimia is a problem, as well as the most common eating disorder is actually binge eating disorder, which is very different than overeating. It is a very serious eating disorder, very rapid consumption of food that's usually done in secrecy with lots of shame and guilt.
Tell us a little bit more about binge eating.
Well, I think the reason why people are getting more familiar with it, there's now, medications approved, but it's been, around for a while, and patients really struggle. And it is official DSM diagnosis, meaning that there's criteria. And the most important thing in terms of if you have binge eating disorder would be, again, a very rapid consumption of food and then feeling guilty and shameful and feeling out of control during those binges. So it's not overeating, and it's quite easy to tell the difference clinically. And there's very effective treatments versus the anorexia, which is a very painful, long treatment process. Binge eating disorder, we have good medications that work, there's good therapy that works, and there's nutritional support that also works.
Is binge eating also related to any type of genetic condition?
The only studies probably related to family histories of depression and other eating disorders, but it's not as clearly genetic as the anorexia research.
As I mentioned in the introduction and earlier in the interview, there's a more recent condition called orthorexia nervosa. What is orthorexia and how is this diagnosed?
Yeah, orthorexia is I think, very concerning diagnosis, although it's not a real official diagnosis. So it's not in the DSM. So we don't call it an official diagnosis, but it is a very over concern around healthy foods. So a very kind of inflexible, rigid pattern of people use the word eating clean or eating good. And this becomes a diagnosis when the obsessions really impair their lives, where they can't eat, they can't function, they're not able to eat in public, not able to eat with family members. So it's this obsessive concern about certain foods, dietary restrictions that really affect social interactions.
And when was this first diagnosed?
I think it was in the 90s. It was a physician. I don't even think it was a psychiatrist, just started seeing it in his patients. And it's quite common that we see it with patients with anorexia and other eating disorders. And we often see it with those with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, because it really does appear to be related to obsessional thoughts that this food is dangerous or something will happen if they eat that food. And then it becomes a very rigid pattern.
And this was originally found by a Dr. Stephen Bratman, is that correct?
Yes, yeah, that's it.
And in your work, you had pointed to a test for orthorexia. And some of the questions that were there are, do you spend more than 3 hours a day thinking about your diet? Do you plan your meals several days ahead? Is the nutritional value of your meal more important than the pleasure of eating it? Has the quality of your life decreased as the quantity of your diet has increased? Have you become stricter with yourself lately? Does your self-esteem get a boost from healthy eating? Have you given up foods you used to enjoy in order to eat the quote-unquote right foods? Does your diet make it difficult for you to eat out, distancing yourself from family and friends? Do you feel guilty when you stray from your diet? And do you feel at peace with yourself and in total control when eating healthily? So this is something that people start to see what they're eating as possibly harmful. Is that correct?
Yes, but once an individual is kind of in that black hole, it's very hard for them to see themselves. That's why that list of questions hopefully can just stimulate somebody from the thought process that maybe this rigid, inflexible pattern is affecting my life. Too often, it becomes a challenge to help many patients with orthorexia get into treatment.
Now, are as many people affected by orthorexia as they are by anorexia?
Well, because there's not a lot of research, and that's why they couldn't put it in the official psychiatric manual, DSM, we don't really know the numbers. So it's very hard to compare with the other eating disorders. I think just being in the field clinically, we've certainly been seeing it more over the past 10, 15 years than when I started.
I know a lot of folks who, without actual medical diagnosis, say that they have sensitivity to wheat and are gluten-free, or sensitivity to dairy and are dairy-free, and will start eating supplemental foods that do not contain wheat or do not contain dairy, do not contain gluten. Is that something that contributes to this?
Well, really important question, because many of the patients that we admit to a hospital for anorexia nervosa were told by a physician, naturopath, or they read on the internet that they should avoid gluten or dairy or one class of food. And that starts them on that dietary restriction on a path of anorexia nervosa. So I'm very concerned about someone with an eating disorder to make those kind of blanket statements, but I'm absolutely understand and recommend eliminating gluten, dairy, or other food items to many individuals who do have food sensitivities that often can affect their mood.
And does this thought pattern become obsessive?
For orthorexia, absolutely. That's by definition what we have when these thoughts are become intrusive and obsessive, as you described, and just really inflexible.
What are the physical effects of orthorexia?
Well, it becomes similar to what we see in anorexia, because as an individual kind of falls into that black hole of restrictive eating, and particularly if they have a OCD, obsessive compulsive diagnosis, they start restricting more and more foods. So we see some of the same nutritional deficiencies, electrolyte abnormalities, and it's potentially life-threatening, similar to our anorexic patients.
This can actually affect the heart, right?
Yeah, electrolyte abnormalities, potassium in particular, can affect the heart. Magnesium deficiency can affect lots of symptoms. So again, everyone's unique in terms of what happens when they restrict and essentially go into starvation. But too often there are medical complications that are at times irreversible.
And we talked about obsession. What are the other psychological components of orthorexia?
Well, obsessions usually go with compulsions. So there's usually, not always, but sometimes there are compulsive behaviors that could be exercising extensive periods of times. It could be food preparation, washing, worried about germs, things of that nature. For many that don't have the OCD, the depression and anxiety that comes from following this very rigid eating pattern is just very sad to see.
And you shared that it also affects cognitive ability.
Well, the brain is the most metabolically active organ in the body. It's only a couple pounds, 2% of our body weight, but 25% of our metabolic energy. So if you start restricting nutrients and calories, the brain function is going to be affected first. So yes, you're going to see some cognitive decline, memory issues, mood, that just oftentimes without treatment persists.
And how does it affect socialization?
As someone becomes more rigid, they're unable to eat with other people. You can't go out for dinner because the food is not clean or pure, or you can't go to that restaurant. And then other people are finding these behaviors too challenging to be around. So, we know our social contacts are critical for our health. And as social contacts minimize and those connections get displaced with over obsession around food, it has implications for brain health.
You list several criterion for determining the nature of the orthorexia and diagnosis. Give us an example of some of those obsessive preoccupations.
Well, some of them could be related to fat content. Some of them could be just related to dietary rules about how they eat. Many of them are related to what they feel is, clean and pure. Many associate this kind of very vague concept of inflammation and talk about inflammatory foods. So, and if you talk to 10 patients with orthorexia, you're going to get 10 different sets of rigid rules, but they're mostly focused around these describing foods as either good or bad, and that becomes the pattern that gets them in trouble.
And does this also produce anxiety?
Anxiety is usually the driver, and this kind of rigid behavior tends to bind the anxiety for many of our patients, certainly those with OCD. So if you kind of stop the rituals or get in the way of some of the beliefs, the anxiety just kind of explodes, and it's very intolerable for many of our patients.
And then someone who is orthorexic might look at a food group and find that food group is undesirable based upon their understanding.
Either something they believe, something they read, kernel of truth, but yes, and then they, again, restrict, similar to what we described about fats, major food groups that are essential for health.
Absolutely. What are some of does it affect people's jobs, their vocations?
We've had patients have to go on disability, the patients that end up coming to the hospital, for treatment, medical complications due to the restrictive behaviors. So untreated, and typically with that obsessive compulsive disorder, what we call comorbidity, it impairs many aspects of their life and functioning.
And obviously, these can lead to issues with self-worth, their identity, their body image as an anorexia.
Yes, oftentimes these disorders kind of converge and overlap, and those are really most challenging to treat, because if we need to restore weight on someone with anorexia and orthorexia, the breaking that belief system is very challenging.
My guest is Dr. James Greenblatt. We'll be back with more after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network. Imagine yourself being transported to India, to the banks of the Ganga and an ashram in Rishikesh. Visualize that you are welcome to satsang with an American sannyasi who shares the wisdom of her guru. Your visualization has manifested. Join Sattvi Bhagawati Saraswati for inspiration and transformation every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions, but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Hi, we're the Goo Goo Dolls. We're fortunate that we can give our daughters everything they need to grow and learn. But not every child can focus on classes and play dates.
Nearly 13 million kids in the U.S. face hunger. That's 1 in 6. School lunch might be their only meal each day, and it's heartbreaking to imagine any child going to bed hungry. We're dreaming of a perfect day when kids can smile, play, and just be kids without worrying about where their next meal will come from. Feeding America is working to make that perfect day a reality.
Each year, the Feeding America network of food banks rescues billions of pounds of good food that would have gone to waste. That food is given to families and children in need. Being a kid should be about doing things that make an ordinary day extraordinary. Learning to play an instrument, building a sandcastle, hosting tea parties. Hunger should never be an obstacle to growing up.
You can help end childhood hunger in your community by visiting feedingamerica.org.
Brought to you by Feeding America and the Ad Council.
Ascending Hearts is no ordinary dating site, but a spiritual dating site with a purpose, to link you with your soulmate. We engineer the serendipity so you can trust that you will attune with someone that has the same matching vibration as you. Ascending Hearts, the conscious dating site for the spiritually aware. Try Ascending Hearts for free. AscendingHearts.com.
So I'm a cat, and I just moved in with this new human, and she's got this little toy she's always playing with, all day long. Tap, 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 bloop, bloop. She can't put it down. There it is. Oh, and get this. She even talks to it. Last week she asked it for Chinese, and guess what? Egg rolls showed up. Like magic. Humans have cool toys.
A person is the best thing to happen to a shelter pet. Be that person. Adopt. Brought to you by the Ad Council and the ShelterPetProject.org.
Dad, I picked up your pills, made your lunch, and your laundry is done.
When you care for a loved one, you take care of everything. But are you taking care of yourself? Find free care guides at aarp.org/caregiving. Brought to you by AARP and the Ad Council.
More than 24 million Americans have an autoimmune disorder, and that number continues to grow. I'm Sharon Saylor, and I'm one of those 24 million. To put that number in perspective, cancer affects about 9 million and heart disease up to 22 million. That's why I've brought together top experts and those thriving regardless of their diagnosis to bring you the latest, most up-to-date information. Join me, Sharon Saylor, Friday night, 7 p.m. Eastern, for the Autoimmune Hour on Life Interrupted Radio to find out how to live your life uninterrupted.
Back on Vox Novus, my guest this week is Dr. James Greenblatt. We're talking about eating disorders, and we're talking about orthorexia nervosa. Dr. Greenblatt, what is the treatment for orthorexia?
The treatment has to be individualized because there's a wide range of symptoms. There are times that medications can be used and can be helpful, particularly before someone is very underweight, because medicines don't work well at all with anorexia nervosa. So there are medicines that can sometimes be helpful for the obsessional thinking and the anxiety. The therapy, the cognitive behavioral therapy, is also very important because helping individuals understand some of the cognitive distortions that are affecting their life. And then again, my work is these nutritional deficiencies that were either genetically, these individuals had higher need, and or due to the restricting of food. So nutritional supplements, psychotherapy, and medication, orthorexia can be treated.
What about relaxation training?
I think some lifestyle changes, sleep being the most important, and then the mindfulness and relaxation has profound implications. We have research now going back many years that mindfulness, meditation has changes both the structure and function of the brain, and sometimes that for some of these kids that can be the key that unlocks a path to recovery.
Is there a way in the cognitive behavior therapy of demonstrating to those who are suffering with orthorexia what they're doing so that they see it from an external point of view?
There's some experimentation on virtual reality programs, and there are, group exercises where people, outline their body and help them kind of visualize things. And they're kind of varying degrees of effectiveness in that work. And again, if the brain does not have the core nutrients, or there's a higher need for certain neurotransmitters, therapy just really lags behind. So my goal is always to support a biological foundation first, and then therapy becomes much more powerful.
You had mentioned that this was first really recognized in the 1990s. Has the prevalence of diet books, fitness trainers, gyms, and the bombardment of advertising showing healthy bodies and people working out, has that affected this?
Oh, absolutely. I think clear correlation as rates go up, and whether they're finding information on social media or at the gym, a very significant increase in rates.
Has the pandemic exacerbated eating disorders?
Without question. Every eating disorder program in the country is full with waiting lists. In Europe, I talked to somebody whose family had to wait 9 months to get into a 24-hour treatment program, all exacerbated by the pandemic. Some of it were kids that were treated, relapsed. Others were individuals just looking at a computer, comparing pictures, starting exercise, starting not eating. So the pandemic, fueled by everyone's anxiety and uncertainty, had pretty dramatic implications for eating disorders.
And lockdown and social isolation?
Yes. Had, just really skyrocketed the numbers, and it was hard to get treatment. Virtual treatment was utilized, helpful, but not the same as in-person treatment.
Now, we talked about this a lot. Social media and those who are called influencers, do they contribute to eating disorders?
I think after the current hearings on Facebook and Instagram, I've been asked many times, and my answer is they don't cause eating disorders, but absolutely aggravate. So that, gasoline on the fire. And for some vulnerable kids who are starting to have low self-esteem, restrict their calories, that social media, those websites that support eating disorders, that is the gasoline on a fire that can really create havoc and get kids in trouble.
If someone finds that a loved one is being affected by orthorexia or another eating disorder, what should they do?
I think getting medical attention first, make sure that the pediatrician or the family practice doctor, evaluates you or your child to make sure there's not a nutritional deficiency or medical problem that could be treated. And after that, it's getting into treatment, because again, the earlier we can get individuals into treatment, the success is much higher.
And is treatment for orthorexia as widespread as treatment for anorexia?
I would say over the past couple of years, yes. Therapists are more aware of it. Dietitians are more aware of it. So it's certainly not uncommon across all eating disorder treatment programs. I think the most important message, though, is to make sure you find somebody who's familiar with eating disorders and particularly orthorexia.
Now, you had talked about how society and culture are really not to blame initially for anorexia, that there is a genetic component involved. But what may we as a society and culture do to embrace and help those who have these conditions?
I think the most important is to start talking about it, which we are. There is movements across many circles, one called, health at every size. So not body shaming, understanding everyone's different. But the other part is we need to protect our kids. And I do believe there needs to be stricter kind of guidelines for social media for some of these young kids because they are destructive.
And what else can we do especially with children, to help them avoid these patterns?
Well, the sad reality is often when we interview someone who gets in the hospital, there's somebody that said something that had a profound effect. And it's been the pediatrician who told the child they were too fat, needed to lose weight, that triggered eating disorder. But, more common, it's a parent. It's usually one parent who's continually talking about weight and eating, and you need to lose weight. And it's shameful, it's humiliating, and at some point, it has profound implications in triggering, again, those genetically vulnerable kids.
And not anorexia or orthorexia, but people who are true overeaters, who have issues with the amount of food they consume. What would you suggest for them?
I think the material, on the binge eating, could be understood. But I think the most important message that I have doing this for many, many years is that kind of eating, hunger and satiety are biological messages. Now, they're profound psychological factors as well. But oftentimes, by changing diet, by addressing nutritional support, we can help individuals control appetite, hunger, and satiety, which with therapy can help individuals kind of regulate eating behaviors, which has profound implications. And we're all aware of the stats, of obesity and diabetes that, directly related to this kind of uncontrolled dietary intake of certainly the processed carbohydrates.
And one thing I'll share on a very personal level, I had weight challenges since childhood. And a lot of that came from growing up in a family, especially with grandparents who saw food as the answer to everything. It's good for you, and you're not eating enough, and whatever. It wired in my mind this concept of comfort and eating being mixed together. And it lasted into my adulthood, and about 12 years ago, I was at the highest weight in my life, which was almost 400 pounds, and I knew how dangerous it was. And at the time, I consulted with gastric surgeons, and I had what was known as a sleeve gastrectomy, and I ended up losing 180 pounds. Now, I'm not suggesting this or recommending this to anyone else. This is all a personal decision with your doctor. But what I learned from that experience, because you're restricted in the amount of food you can intake once they do that procedure, you have what they call a banana stomach, a much reduced stomach area. So there's not a lot of room to put food into, is that I actually understood what happened. And I was able to learn to modify my eating habits that had been taught to me or impressed upon me erroneously or in a loving way, whatever it might have been all those years. And so consequently, had I had that mentality prior to my huge weight gain, I might not have had to have gone through the procedure.
Sure. There's just many factors, and you're absolutely right. The psychological kind of impinges on the biological. And I think the message, and thank you for sharing that, is that people can get better, be it surgery, medicines, nutrition, behavior change, and dietary changes. But we do have tools to help.
Absolutely. What would you like readers to take away from Answer to Anorexia?
The most important thing I can share is what I've said a couple of times. The earlier we can treat kids with eating disorders, the path is recovery and remission. If we wait too long, it becomes a life-threatening illness. And the message in the hundreds of pages just kind of reiterate the importance of nutritional support. We talked about zinc and B12, but it's also the other B vitamins and the fatty acids. And there is a path to recovery.
My guest, Dr. James Greenblatt. Dr. Greenblatt, please tell our listeners where they can get your books and find out more about you and this wonderful work that you do.
My website is jamesgreenblattmd.com, and our kind of educational platform is called psychiatryredefined.org.
And on psychiatryredefined.org, what may people who are not professionals, who are not in the medical industry, find?
There's a long list of, I think there's 50 hours of free webinars, the webinars on eating disorders, and then there are courses on binge eating disorder, courses on anorexia that everyone is welcome to look at.
Dr. Greenblatt, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your very, very important work.
Well, thank you, Victor, and appreciate the opportunity and keep up the good work.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us on Vox Novus. I'm Victor, the Voice Fuhrman. Have a wonderful week.